Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do most Sundays. You can ask gardening questions down below this video and I pick from those each week. Again, you guys continue to ask great questions, variations of questions I've answered in the past, and then, very timely questions, for folks who are maybe have the same exact question as you, because the same thing's going on in their garden. So again, thanks for the participation, and continue to ask questions down below. If I'm not picking yours, it's not on purpose. It's just I get to, fill up the 2 pages and call it a video. The Learn to Garden series, thanks again to all the folks who have purchased that. Again, there's going to be about 60 hours is what I'm estimating of material on that gardening series, and there's a discount code below. And also there's going to be other things on there too. I'm actually in the process of creating a deer resistant list, just based on kind of the plants that I know to be kind of deer proof, and then some other ones that people think are deer resistant, but may or may not be. And I'm doing those by common name and by Latin name, in alphabetical order by each. And so those pages will be going up in the next few days on the Learn to Garden series over on the website, my website, which is HortTube.com. Okay, enough of that. This past week, we did a video down in Florida at Goodwin Orchids. That video went up. A video with the Yopon Brothers tea company, American tea company, which they use Yopon. It's Yopon holly tea, which is a native plant to the southeast. Just kind of interesting content for a native plant that happens to be in the southeast United States that also is caffeinated, and the tea is very good. It's really good. I was not, they're not paying me anything. They're not paying me. I don't, nothing, but the tea is actually quite good. So if you haven't seen that video, check it out. And then one over at AgriStarts for tissue culture, for how a lot of the plants that are in your landscape, a lot of these plants are either difficult to root or difficult to produce in numbers for various different reasons, or they're very virus heavy. You'll see that with a lot of blueberries, blackberries. A lot of our fruit plants can have virus issues. Roses can have virus issues. And rather than pass them down the line, you can use tissue culture to start the plants. But I thought that video is fairly interesting. I did not show everything there. They have some, AgriStarts has been doing this for a long time, and there were some things there that they didn't want me to show for good reason. They've got some engineering. They've got some processes that they can't go on camera, and I don't blame them at all for that. So anyway, there are a couple things missing from that video of a very, very high end, a very, very technical plant starting operation. Okay, and then put up a video on the Garden Plants channel this week for Southern Live Oaks. That's Garden Plants with Jim Putnam. You can just search that on YouTube, and that channel will come up if you want to go over there and subscribe. That channel is going to be nothing but plants. Back to the old days of HortTube with Jim Putnam. It's just all about individual plants or groups of plants, and that's all that channel is. This channel will be all things horticulture. That one will just be, if you want to research a plant, there'll be a video over there for it eventually. Okay, let's get to some questions. I continue to get a million questions about cold damage. Steph and I have been in Florida. I was in Baltimore for a week, almost 5 days, 6 days, and then came home for 1 day. And then Steph and I took off to Florida for over 2 weeks. I literally pulled back in the driveway just a few minutes ago. So we were down in Florida for 2 weeks, filmed those things I just talked about. And I haven't done another video I had talked about doing with some photos that you guys had sent. But I continue to get tons of questions about cold damage on plants. And in fact, me walking back into this garden right now, I can see some additional, nothing severe, but cold damage is continuing to show up. And I don't know if you guys are seeing that in your gardens as well. I'm assuming that probably everybody is. Some things that I didn't think were stung, now have a branch here or there that looks a little, the leaves are black, or so it's kind of interesting. I don't think I've lost anything, but definitely there's a little more damage than I initially thought out here. Going forward in the next week or two, I'm going to be pruning all of those kinds of things, talking about those kinds of things in videos. There's going to be edging videos, new bed creation videos, pruning videos, fertilizing video, so on and so forth. We're jumping back into the garden full time here for the next few months and getting it looking its best for this summer. So follow along with that, and I'll be talking about the damaged plants as we go as well. The things that are damaged out here, which again, I don't think anything's going to die. It's just, but there is more damage than I originally thought. Okay, let's see. Somebody asked about, and I'm getting a lot of questions about should I, because you have some damage, and let's say you're in zone 7 and you have some damage that plants that are supposed to be hardy in zone 7, should you only be planting things that are in zone 6 and assume you're just in zone 6? Possibly. The answer to that is that if I go through zone 7A, zone 7A would probably start back toward Greensboro in the state of North Carolina. If I go to Greensboro, there's probably places in Greensboro that are almost zone 8, just depending on what kind of position it is. If it's in, getting a west or a north wind, if it's near downtown. There's all kinds of microclimates within these zones, and so I can't really tell you that. You may experience more damage in zone 7A than other people do in zone 7A with the same exact plants, just based on the position, the way you're in a valley and the nighttime temperatures may fall a little lower. You may have some more sustained wind, all kinds of reasons. Also, this event was just very different. The rate at which the temperature fell on plants that were not prepared for it was very, very different, and it was all wind driven. That wind just drove the temperature down from 60 to 13 here in this garden in just a few hours, that took place for that to happen. And again, I've said several times, I don't think 13 would have hurt my, Mahonia back here that's got a few limbs on it that are black. It wouldn't have hurt it. 13 wouldn't even have thought about 13. If 13 had happened after just kind of a normal fall in temperature over a few weeks. But instead it happened in a few hours. And so that's part of it as well. And then a lot of you may be watching and have very new gardens. So a lot of your, if it's only been in the ground for less than 24 months, and that may be the case with a lot of plants because there's a lot of new gardeners since COVID, people doing more in their own gardens, in their own spaces. I think somebody said there's 28 million new gardeners or something since the beginning of COVID. And so, it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know if that's backing off some now that, people are going to Disney or whatever. I have no idea. But that's a lot of new gardeners. So I'm assuming that's a lot of new plants that have gone in the ground, and new plants are definitely more vulnerable. So there's that too. If you'd had an older, more mature garden, potentially less damage. Anyway, there you go. That's enough about damage for today. Somebody wanted an update on my hot blonde Japanese maple back there. It's completely fine. It's dormant. It's just a stick sticking out of the ground and one other branch off to the side of it. They got one in and didn't know whether to put it in the ground or not. If the ground is workable and the Japanese maple is dormant, I'd absolutely stick it in the ground. If the Japanese maple had started leafing out some and I was up in zone 6, no, I would probably want to protect it some for the next few weeks. But if it's completely dormant, if it's coming in the mail and it's completely dormant and the ground is workable, put it in the ground. That's what I would say. Oh, and then the other question they had was about full sun. That plant, even in zone 6, I think those gold Japanese maples are more sun tolerant. That particular one was picked because it is more sun tolerant, but even then, I probably don't think you'd want 15 hours of direct sun on a gold Japanese maple. Half a day would be about the most I would probably want to put on it. Let's see. So somebody said the Mount Cuba Center had put out some information recently on Carex, and I wrote that down just because I've talked to the Mount Cuba Center 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we're going to be doing some video work up there later in the summer and early fall. I did that video with Richard Hawkey on trialing at the Chicago Botanic Garden. The Mount Cuba Center is very, very similar, does very, very similar work in trialing plants, and does just great research. Almost everybody's using Richard Hawkey's system of 3 years in the ground up there at Chicago Botanic Garden. It's kind of interesting. He kind of, if you haven't seen that video from the summer, it is super interesting. He kind of invented the way plant trialing is done. So before, people might stick something in the ground, and if it died, they just went, well, that thing dies here. Or they put it in the ground and it thrived for 1 year, and they go, this thing does great here. And neither one of those things may be accurate. You may, so they basically trial things for 3 years. And so you're going to get a real winter, you're going to get a real summer, you're going to get a real dry period, you're going to get a real wet period. By trialing things obviously the longer you trial them, the more accurate the information will be. Which is the case with a lot of new plants coming out. Hopefully they're being trialed long enough, I think there's better trialing now. I would say 15, 20 years ago, a lot of new plants that were being released, were definitely weak. Now I'm seeing more and more and more, I see new plants being released that, are more vigorous in the garden. I can just tell they're much more well tested before they're releasing them. And the other thing is the better plant may present itself 2 and 3 years down the road. The first year you look at something, if that's all you picked from, you might pick this one, and 3 or 4 up the line, don't look quite as good. But then 2 years later, they're the best ones. So, you should look at them as long as possible and still make money. People, they're trying to introduce new plants and make money, so you can't look at it for 20 years before you release it, Okay, so somebody is down at Holden Beach in North Carolina, which is very, very sandy soils, as you would expect along any coastal area, anywhere, and wanted to know, somebody recommended they should put down several loads of topsoil to improve their soil before they start planting, and what I thought about that. I don't, several things. Number one, what is topsoil? Topsoil could be any variation. I have seen really, really, really poor soil delivered and called topsoil. And stuff that's kind of fluffy when it arrives, because they run it through a machine to kind of sometimes take rocks out, and then sometimes just to kind of fluff it up. And then it goes in the truck, and it does look pretty good. And then if you let it sit there in the pile for a couple weeks, it'll get a crust on the outside of it. It's just terrible soil. So I don't know. Did it come from an old farm field where the soil's just been trashed over some period of time? I don't even know where a lot of it would originate from. I'm sure there's really good topsoil out there to buy. And there's somebody that does topsoil that watches my channel that probably has great topsoil. I have no idea. But that's the first thing that kind of concerns me, is that I don't even, just because somebody calls something topsoil, I don't even know what that means. Where do you go scrape off, the top 4 inches of soil that's came out of some neighborhood that then those folks are moving into, and then they're ordering topsoil from the next victim, down the road, where they took that topsoil off and brought it there. Most of the time, I think it's, not most of the time, but a good portion of the time that I've ordered topsoil to job sites, it has not been very good material. If you got some sort of topsoil and compost blend, maybe so it's slightly improved, maybe I would do that. But again, if you're asking me whether I would order topsoil from somebody, or I would order wood chips, if I could get free wood chips, I'd absolutely go with the wood chips. If you've got a little time to wait, wood chips will improve that soil enough and start to slow down that water falling through it. And then you're going to be mulching in the future. You're going to have to stay on top of using hardwood mulch and things to keep that water, keep that, you can improve it. You can improve it from the top down doing that. Otherwise, I would probably till some compost directly into that sand if I was creating a new space. And then on top of that, put wood chips on it, and then wait a period of time and then start planting. That's probably the strategy I would use. But no, I would not order any, soil that I don't know. I mean, I don't know where it's coming from, whether it's, it could be off some farm field where they put down way too much potassium for 20 years. And so, you know what I mean? You're actually bringing in a problem into your garden. You would have to, I wouldn't want to do it. So that's enough of that. So somebody said, how are multi-trunk trees created? And then they said, I have a dumb question for you at the beginning. There are no dumb questions ever on this channel. Everybody has to start somewhere, and this one's certainly not a, by no standard is this a bad question. It's, how are multi-trunk trees created? Now, more and more, we see just 3 trees going into a container. So if you're buying a 3-trunk river birch or a 3-trunk crepe myrtle, frequently now it's just 3 plants stuck in the container that were grown as standards or single trunk trees and then put in the container. The way it was done in the past, and it's still done by some, is you take the tree, let it grow for a while, and then you just literally cut it almost to the ground, and then you'll get multiple trunks will come up, and then you select from those the 3 most vigorous ones or the 5 most vigorous ones, whatever amount of trunks you're going for, and you keep those and you stake those out at an angle from themselves, because you need to have the 3 trunks going out a bit as they go up. Otherwise the limbs end up, you know, crossing over one another and damaging each other. But there's two strategies. One, you grow a single trunk tree, you cut it to the ground or almost to the ground, and then it will sucker from the roots. Basically, you're creating suckering, or you stick 3 in a pot. Either way. Oh, somebody had some decomposed pine trees in their yard. The trees had fallen and they've decomposed for a long time. Wanted to know if they could just use that for mulch. Yeah, absolutely. As long as you can, move it around, break it up, that kind of thing. But anything that's partially broken down like that's perfect. Absolutely perfect for mulch. And I think that was the question. I had Steph writing these down while we were driving back from Florida. And so I don't know. I think that's what the question was. Somebody asked how long that wounds should heal on a plant before they get wet. I guess meaning before it rains. Like if I go out here and prune off a perennial or a tree limb or a shrub, how long before those wounds can get wet and it be okay? Pretty much immediately. I don't think about it. It's just it's just not something that I have ever even thought about. In the nursery business, we would prune a block of plants and then turn the water on it almost immediately, not think about it at all. And that was with pond water, which was a lot worse than the rainwater. Rainwater's pretty clean in comparison to what we were dumping on the plants. And so I don't really think about it at all. I do make sure that my tools are sharp, so I'm not creating raggedy cuts. That would be more concerning to me than water. A good clean cut should seal itself off pretty quickly, and a little rain falling on it after that wouldn't matter. Again, clean cuts, so your hand, whether they're hand pruners or shears or your gas machine that you're using, I don't care, or your saw, make sure you're cutting things off well, and if you're cutting off larger limbs, make sure the cut ends up angled so the water will shed off of it and not up flat or something like that. So just thinking that through on bigger limbs to make sure it's just going to shed water, and that you're cutting them clean. I've shown a lot on the channel over the years about how to prune limbs off trees, and I'm sure in the next couple of weeks that'll come up again in a video, but I don't think about it at all. Let's see. So somebody asked about pine bark versus wood chips. So I thought this was, a question that comes up sometimes just in terms of using bark versus using wood in the garden, and kind of what's the difference. Think about bark as like your skin. It's preventing water from getting in. It's preventing the elements from getting to the important parts on the inside. So think of bark that way. Bark is meant to not break down very easily. It breaks down much slower. So typically we use it as bark in the garden, or typically we use it as mulch in the garden. So top dressing things, because it doesn't break down quite as quickly. And so we don't have to maybe spend as much money on it, repeatedly putting it down. Whereas the interior part of the tree, when you ground up the whole tree, the leaves, the stems, the bark, the wood, everything together, it really kind of sets the world on fire out here in terms of bacteria and microorganisms just going to work, just waking them up, and it just breaks down amazingly fast. Given the right conditions, it just breaks down incredibly fast. And the bark products break down much, much slower than that. Pine bark I will mix into the soil. Hardwood bark I never really mix into the soil. It just there's just a difference between the pine, bark off a pine tree and bark off of an oak. They're very, very different. The bark off of a pine tree, we do mix into our annual borders and perennial beds and that kind of thing. And it's the same stuff that if you take a plant out of a container that you buy from Home Depot or Lowe's or your garden center or wherever, you'll see it's pine bark. is mostly what it's grown in. Probably some bark out on the West Coast too that folks are using. That bark does a pretty good job of not breaking down. It does a good job. It still break down properly, even buried a bit under the ground. But that's really the difference. You have to think of bark as protecting the tree from the elements, and so it's a little bit slower to break down, whereas the inside of the tree breaks down really, really quickly. It'd be just like opening up your chest and finding out how fast, your organs would go away real quick probably. Let's see, probably a bad example there, Jim. So somebody's in zone 8B in Seattle and wants a little 2x2 round shrub and was looking at a little Thuja occidentalis, a little dwarf Thuja. Probably almost any conifer for you is going to work in Seattle, in your zone 8 area, whereas in zone 8 in the southeast, a lot of those conifers don't work very well. It's just very hot, long days in the summertime, where those conifers tend to do a little bit better on the Pacific Northwest. Now, with that said, you guys have had some really, really hot summers. Abnormally hot summers the last few years, and so that's been interesting. And if I was concerned about it from a heat standpoint, I might go with some sort of little dwarf cryptomeria or a dwarf juniper of some kind, because they tend to be a little bit more heat tolerant. But that dragon prince cryptomeria would be probably a good plant that you could keep in that size range, that would be a little more heat tolerant than the eastern. That Thuja occidentalis, and that includes emerald arborvita, globe arborvita, lots of them, you guys know. There's just a ton of these things on the market, are native very far in the Northeast, like north of Pennsylvania. I've said this before, things are native in like Canada. So they don't like a tremendous amount of heat on them, and the emerald arborvita, especially from here south, really suffers, but there's millions of them sold here. So they're beautiful in the containers, so I understand why people buy them, but they're not particularly that great in the ground here, that you can leave them alone and not water them and think about them forever. Okay, so somebody's got a Ralston hardy viburnum. That's supposed to be a little dwarf viburnum obovatum, which is a native viburnum to the southeast. That's getting larger than what they thought it was going to get, because it's supposed to be, stay pretty small, and mine's, I can see it through here. It's only about a foot tall. And the ones over here in front of the library at NC State University are only about 2 feet tall. So I don't know how tall it's getting. I don't know if it's maybe in too much shade. If it's in the full sun and it's really, really stretching, part of me wonders, number one, if that's what it really is or it was mismarked. And number two, their only real question was, when is a good time to move it? I think you could move it whenever you wanted to move it. I don't think you're going to hurt it. We're past probably the worst part of the winter, so if your soil's workable, I'd go ahead and move it. They asked me if they should prune it at the same time they move it. I typically do. So I'll take 10 or 15% off the top of the plant and then move it for sure. But I do wonder if it's really, really stretching big, whether it's just regular viburnum obovatum that was somehow mistagged, switched around at some point in the process, because that thing stays pretty daggone compact. Even if it's going to get bigger, it seems to get bigger, without limbs going everywhere. Okay, somebody ordered a Japanese maple mail order, wanted to know about conditioning it for their area, and I guess that means that they're worried that it won't be ready for the cold wherever it's going. As long as you take it out of the box and it's completely dormant, it will be fine. Doesn't really matter. If you took it out of the box and the buds were breaking, the buds were swelling along the stems, and it was about to leaf out or something like that, but I doubt that's the case. Most people doing mail order Japanese maples are probably doing them in slightly colder areas, mountain areas in North Carolina, that kind of thing, Tennessee, those kinds of places. So it's probably, as long as it's asleep, I would take it out of the box and put it in the ground, and I wouldn't think about it. As long as the ground is workable. I mean, obviously, if your ground's frozen wherever you are, you're going to need to wait until it thaws. But once it is, as long as you keep the plant dormant, I'd put it in the ground. So, talked about not having grass growing right up to the base of trees. Lots of times on this channel over the years. And then they ask about what about ground covers. Hakana cloa, which is that little Japanese forest grass that, gold Japanese forest grass. They're several different varieties of it, or something like Carex. Yeah, those things are perfectly fine. You go in the woods anywhere and you're going to see giant trees, and then you look down at the ground, you're going to see various Carexes, sedges all over the country. Almost doesn't matter the woods you go in, you're going to see various Carexes and things like that. Yes, the real issue with having the grass growing up to your trees, your lawn growing up to the trees, is you're mowing it, fairly frequently. So you're actually exposing the roots to the sun, fairly frequently. You're potentially putting on you're putting more foot traffic under it than you would otherwise, right? Probably some other reasons I could come up with real quick. And just almost nowhere on the planet are those types of grasses, grown, right up to the base of them. They're more needy. These turf grasses, like fescue or bluegrass and those kinds of things, they're just more needy plants than these native Carexes, or even the Japanese forest grass isn't native, but it's certainly it can compete with that tree without any problem. The two of them can live together, and you don't have to do any maintenance in there, and you don't have to put a lot of foot traffic around your tree except for once or twice a year when you mulch. Somebody asked about mixing up soil in containers. So they're doing vegetables in containers, and they're replacing some of the soil each time. Wanted to know if they should rotate all of the soil in the pot, like dump them out and then mix some fresh in and then put it all back in. That's probably the best way to do it. If we're thinking through this, that's probably the best way to do it, is to pull all the soil out, take some away, mix in some new, and then put it all back in, so that the part that's down at the bottom is almost certainly rotting. And that's typically how containers are, right? When we flip them over, we find out the bottom 3 inches are, worms and rotting debris down at the bottom. And so, that's probably ideal. But for me, I don't. What we do on containers is we'll put a shrub in a container, and I wish I had. There's a couple back here in view, and we'll just take some portion of the soil out when we plant some new annuals around them. And then so that shrub ends up staying in there 2 years, and then it moves to a new container later on, and something else goes in there, so it's all new soil. But that, I do eventually replace it all. So I don't go through all that. I would just take 4 inches off the top and put a little bit 4 inches back on, and then maybe mix that up as deep as you can go with a little hand fork or something, or a little shovel. That's probably all I would do. But ideally, you dump all the soil out, remix it up, so it's not just that rotting mass that's at the bottom of most containers. Let's see. Okay, so in a related question on the multi-trunked tree question, somebody else had asked about planting 3 trees together to create a multi-trunk tree. You can do that. I mean, you could go and get 3 small wispy trees and put them together to make a multi-trunk tree. Yeah, absolutely. Again, keep in mind that, those birches or crepe myrtle or whatever it is, I don't know what it is that they were trying to create this look with. They're not going to like it. In 20 years, they're not going to like it. I mean, I would almost predict that 2 of them are going to kill the 3rd one, at some point in the future. It's probably so far out there, though, it's probably not even a thing to worry about. And if it's something you want to do in your garden, do it. Plant 3 trees that close together and rock on, right? Okay. Somebody asked me about having the rocks at the bottom of their containers. Another container question here. Because it seems logical to put rocks at the bottom of the container so that you basically create a water reservoir. I think that's what we think in our minds is going to happen, so that we can't keep them too wet and you don't have that rotting thing I'm talking about down at the bottom of the container. What actually ends up happening, believe it or not, water is drawn to itself. I mean, we know that. It's just, it's almost like a magnet to itself. If you drag a bead of water around a table for a little while, you'll see that. It does the same thing in a container. If you create that gravel layer below it, believe it or not, it just moves the wet spot further up in the container. You're still going to have the wet area. It's just now you've moved it up into the root zone of the plant that you're growing in the container. It actually doesn't work the way you think it's going to work. It sounds completely logical. The main thing is to use a well-drained mix and get the pot off the ground a little bit. If you can put some little feet under the container to allow some air movement, and make sure that the hole in the bottom of the pot, or holes in the bottom of the pot, are always free to drain water out of, and you'll be fine. You don't really need the rocks if you'll do that. This is a good question. Somebody talked about sunflowers, which way they should be facing. So which side of the garden would you put them on? So most of the time sunflowers will move with the sun when they're first opening. Okay, so they'll be facing east in the morning, and then in the evening they'll be facing west, but when the flowers start to be pollinated and really start to show some color, they'll typically lock in kind of an east direction, and east and south direction, so that they get the morning sun right when it comes up. So when they lock their heads in, that's the direction it's going to lock into. It's not going to lock west facing typically. So I think about it putting them back over here, because I know they're going to face this direction and kind of toward the street out that direction. And so we put a few sunflowers on the front foundation out there, and they'll be facing us back there. I can put them on this back bed because they'll be facing the house right here. But if I put them up here by the house, they're going to be facing, they may or may not be facing out here to the lawn. They'll more than likely be facing the house a little bit. So, but they do typically lock more east once the head kind of locks in place, to get that morning sun right when it comes up early in the morning. Somebody talked about walking on perennials when they're dormant. So like a lot of foot traffic over hosta and things like that when they're completely under the ground. I don't think you're probably going to damage the hosta that much when they're dormant like that, but you're not going to necessarily damage that plant itself, but you are damaging the soil, putting lots and lots of foot traffic on it by compacting it. And so the plant is going to have less ability to root out into the surrounding soil and maybe less vigorous when it comes back up. So I try to put as little foot traffic as possible in my beds. You can't prevent all foot traffic, right? I got to get in here and weed. I got to get in here and edge. I got to get in here and mulch. I got to get in here and clean up and prune back. And so I'm in here, but I'm in here as little as possible. So that's the strategy. You wouldn't want to walk on them and walk on them and walk on them, because you will compact the space, and then the plant has just less ability to root out and be vigorous. Let's see. Somebody asked about planting ground covers and other like small shrubs to prevent Bermuda grass from encroaching on their foundation, and then using them as a border to prevent them from going. Bermuda grass will go through anything. I hate to say that. It's a bad answer. Nobody wants that answer, but I don't think there's any ground cover that I could recommend to you that would be aggressive enough to beat Bermuda grass. I go down to Florida and see, it doesn't matter. Anywhere in the southeast that Bermuda grass will grow, and over to southwest, that any place that will grow, it's the worst. I called it the worst weed in a video earlier this year. Literally, I think it is the worst weed, and we use it as turf grass, which is super funny almost. We would just inflict this on ourselves, basically inflict this on our gardens. But you need some sort of really, a concrete barrier. You need some sort of, raised wall, and even that, it can probably wiggle its way through there, but at least slow it down. But a plant itself probably will not slow it down, and in fact, maybe in some cases actually hide it and prevent you from seeing it until it's well back up into where you're trying to keep it out of. So bad answer from Jim. Let's see. Somebody asked about why we wouldn't be working clay soil when it's wet. Several other people came in and said this, answered this, but yeah, you're going to potentially make spaces more compact by walking on clay soils when it's been worked and turned over and that kind of thing. I got a lot of experience with turning over clay soil on wet days here in Raleigh back in my landscape days, and so you just make a mess out of things. But if you're doing like a small space and you're not going to be putting foot traffic on it, I don't see any reason why you can't turn it over and maybe mix some pine bark soil conditioner in with it a little bit if you can find it. Certainly planting individual plants isn't going to hurt anything. But I would, if I had this person said that their clay, when it's dry, is unworkable, period. So, there has to be, you are playing a delicate balance between what is perfect, what is the perfect time to be doing this, and what is, the only time I can do this. So if it's the only time you can work with it, then work with it. This time of year, just try to keep as much foot traffic off of it as possible when you're turning it over and when you're, working with it. When you plant your plants, this time of year, make sure you're not stomping that clay back down as hard as you can stomp it back into the hole. You know, just lightly tamp it down so you leave some air in it. But certainly all of your edging should be done, you know, when it's moist like this. And, you know, so I mean, the answer for you, if it's unworkable at any other time of the year, it doesn't matter whether it's the best time to do it. You got to do it. So just do it, but thinking through it, not to put a lot of foot traffic on it. Don't take a wheelbarrow and run over it. You know, don't, you know, till 100 or 200 feet or turn it over with a shovel or ever how you're doing it, and then run a wheelbarrow back and forth through it, because you will over compact it, even more so than what it is, you know, when it's dry. Those are tough conditions to work in. Okay, let's see. Somebody got plethora delivered to them, mail order, in a little 4-inch pot, and they're in Indiana and the soil's frozen. What should they do? Just make sure the plethora don't wake up until the soil's workable, so that you keep the plethora in the same zone as you, basically. So, and this is true with anything you're buying. If it's, you know, you want to keep it outside as much as you possibly can. If the pot was going to stay frozen for like 2 days, if you left it outside, you can bring it in the house. But don't bring it in the house long enough for it to wake up. Or bring it in the garage would be better, or a shed. You know, someplace that it keeps it up, allows it to thaw out every day. But you need to keep it dormant, and as soon as you can put it, the ground is workable, put them in the ground. They're super cold tolerant. Okay, and then last question for this week. I don't know how many this was, maybe 20 or so. 21 I'm looking at right now, I think. Somebody asked me about what garden shoes I wear. I've answered this question before. I have some Skechers on that are, you know, that don't have shoestrings because I'm 12. My feet are super wide. They're easy to get on and off, and so this is all I wear. I do have boots. You know, if I was doing stone work, I judge it on what I'm doing in the garden. So if I was doing stone work out here, I would have on my boots. But 99% of the chores in the garden are not laying stone, right? They're edging and mulching and, you know, comfortable shoes until the day that you are doing something in the garden where you could possibly drop something on your feet. And those are the days you would want to wear some sort of protective shoe. But otherwise, comfortable beats anything all day long, because you want to be able to do it all day, and you want to be able, you not have a sore back when you're done with it. Other than, you know, I mean, you can get sore backs in the garden, but you know what I mean about just from actually walking, your shoes causing the problem. So comfortable shoes that don't roll. You know, I'm really, you know, if I've got any that might roll, if I'm pushing a wheelbarrow or something like that, I certainly don't want shoes that could roll under me and that kind of thing. So you know, snug and comfortable. And again, because because mentally maybe I'm only like 12, I don't want to tie shoes. I want them at the front door, slip them on, I'm out, I'm working, right? So thank you guys for asking great questions. Ask gardening questions down below this video, and I'll be back next week with another one and lots of content in this garden this week.